And we're joined in studio now by Dan Perry, International Affairs Analyst. Always good to have you with us, Dan.
Lawyer.
Looking at this, is Israel's government going to come down?
It could, but on the other hand, if the Haredim don't find full satisfaction in whatever happens, however this works out, they don't have a lot of better options. Because if the right-wing government that depends on them were replaced by a center-left government that does not depend on them, I'm not so sure that they're going to find a way to continue what is genuinely an outrageous situation that will only get worse as regards the draft of the yeshiva students.
For Israeli society as a whole, this has always been a very critical issue, especially since the war started. We've seen reservists see their years in service extended. We've seen actually combat deployed soldiers had their terms in the field extended, and yet you have something in the vicinity of 20% of the population that doesn't serve at all.
Einstein proposed one definition of insanity about a half century ago or more. This is another. The issue is essentially the birth rate. 7 kids per family in Haredi families. Any boy in those families doesn't learn math, English, or science in high school, and then as long as they stay in yeshiva, don't go to the army, but they have to stay in yeshiva, and so they don't work either. This has led to the Haredi males having one of the lowest participation in labor rates of any identifiable sector in the Western world, and is an increasing drag on the economy here, not to mention the societal problem because of the military issue, which comes down to, and this is a somewhat unpopular point, but this is what it is, the birth rate. Because of that birth rate, the exemptions that when Begin applied them to all yeshiva students in the sector affected less than 5% of the annual potential draftees, male Jewish 18-year-olds in Israel. That grew to 9% in the 90s, and it's now a quarter, and it will be half in one generation, because the proportion of Haredim in the Israeli population doubles as a proportion of the overall population every 20 years. Now, this obviously is unsustainable, but it's more than the military. This has to do with society, with the economy. It cannot continue. Now, the Haredim are an essential, fundamental, and critical part of the Israeli right-wing religious bloc. They control that bloc, which is why Netanyahu has to continue to humor what is a devastating thing for Israel. We'll see how it works out, but it's probably primed to explode.
I mean, if you just look at the demographics, as you mentioned, it's about 6.1 children for the Haredi families versus 3.1 for the general population. But it means that in a generation, they're going to be a substantial majority of the voting public, 2 generations or so. At that point, how is there any resistance to a draft exemption? What happens when they're the majority of the
clearly
population?
Fall apart. There's no way. You know, there's an old Israeli joke that 1/3 of the people pay taxes, 1/3 work, and 1/3 serve. That was always a slight exaggeration, but with every day that passes, it brings us closer to that, and that clearly cannot continue to prosper. It cannot continue to survive, and therefore something's going to have to give. Israel cannot defend itself this way, and what has become acute at this point in history is the war in Gaza that requires boots on the ground, and the army's running out of people. And you have the conscription term for non-Haredi, religious and secular, non-Haredi 18-year-olds increasing, and you have people who are like 40 years old who are now spending 3-4 months in the reserves because of this. It's clear it can't continue. The problem is, how can it be resolved with a right wing in power that depends on the Haredim? This is obviously a potentially fatal problem for Netanyahu, because polls show that in his own Likud, which is about half the right religious bloc, there's opposition to this continuing. Now, you could say that's politically suicidal because they need the Haredim. But anyone in Likud who has a shred, a glimmer of a gleam of national responsibility knows it can't continue. And right now, all of that is focused on Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, who does, and who has made it clear that he will not support the proposed law that, because of a series of legal machinations in Israel, must pass by April Fool's Day, which would essentially formalize the sweeping exemption of Haredim from the military. By definition, them being yeshiva students.
I mean, we're talking about this in the sense of a singular government right now. Let's say that Netanyahu's government does fall over this issue, which is, as you mentioned, a very real possibility. Well, you get another government, possibly drawn from Benny Gantz and some of the others. They serve for a certain amount of years. The exemption is deleted for that amount of years, but you still have a growing percentage of the population that is going to want that exemption back. This is a recipe for permanent instability.
I'm not sure, because nothing is permanent in life. That you're born Haredi doesn't mean you have to die Haredi, and that you live all your life as a Haredi doesn't mean you have to not work and never serve in the army. There are plenty of ultra-Orthodox Jews in Belgium and in the U.S. that that go about their lives as members of society, that contribute as is demanded by that society. This happened because Menachem Begin in 1977 granted yeshiva students this sweeping exemption from the military, not understanding, not doing the math basically, as regards the birth rate. My sense is that there's a Jewish concept called chefetz chaim, a desire for life. Organizations, companies, countries, societies have a desire for life. If Israel has a desire for life, it will fix this problem. And the Haredim will have to probably understand that this sweeping and completely absurd exemption from their basic duties as citizens will have to come to an end. And it's been, as they say in Britain, a good innings for them, about a half century of this, but it will end.